Daddy by Victor Laval. 1. They made the baby sleep under a table. Correction, they let him sleep under a table. They'd started him at birth in a Moses basket next to their bed, then graduated to a crib when he turned 3 months. At 6 months, they switched to a travel crib from Phil and Ted's, because the baby rolled around a lot, and in the travel crib, they didn't have to worry he'd ever fall out. That lasted a year and some change. Finally, at 2 years old, the boy was ready for a bed. But they lived in New York City, in a tiny one-bedroom, tighter than a cat's asshole. This meant the living room had become the boy's bedroom. Because they had a pull-out couch in here, it was also the guest room whenever cousins from Philadelphia or Virginia rolled through. This meant moving the slim kitchen table to the back and turning it into a makeshift bed for the child. Store baby supplies on top and a foam mattress underneath, and that's how you spell ingenuity. But the blonde wood table, bought from Target 5 years ago, looked sad. Downright pathetic. This is where they were going to sleep, James? Fuck that. His father painted the table green, and his mother bought tension rods, had short curtains made from old, bright sheets. She hung the curtains between the legs of the table so the space inside felt like a special, secluded place, like lying inside the sleeper car of a train. They slipped 4 or 5 of the boys' toys inside. They bought glow-in-the-dark stars and moons and affixed them to the bottom of the tabletop, so at night, when the child looked up, he'd find a starry sky. When James's mom brought him home from daycare, they introduced him to his special space and waited to see if he'd cry about the change. He climbed inside, then asked his mother to climb in with him, told his father to close the curtain. Once it was dark in there, the boy gasped and shouted, "I see stars!" That sound you hear is a mother and father patting themselves and each other on the back. 2. About 6 a.m., he heard James calling out, "Daddy? I'm awake." His given name was Alfred, though no one had ever called him that, not even his parents. Anyone who knew him called him Red, though this wasn't because he had red hair or anything like that. People had tried to call him Al, and he vetoed it. There were a few tentative attempts at Fred, but those ended in fights. Red, though? That went down smooth as good coffee. Though these days he understood his real name had been changed to Daddy, and he had absolutely no vote in the matter. His wife used to call him Daddy on occasion, in bed, but that stopped real quick once James was born. They both found it icky once it was actually true. Red's wife, Loretta, stayed asleep beside him. He rolled out because it was his morning. Out of the bedroom, through the kitchen, past the bathroom, and to the living room. He'd need to stop thinking of it as a living room. Now it was for James. Just about everything was for James. He and Loretta had made it past the early months, when a statement like that could be full of resentment and exhaustion. They changed. By 2 years old, they'd reached a better phase. Just about everything was for James, and it felt good to give it. Red walked into the bedroom to find James's head sticking out from between the curtains. That boy's bean looked damn near adult-sized. Had been that way since birth. Funny what you learn to love in your own child. If the boy had come out with tentacles, no doubt his dad would have found them cute by now. James looked at his father, light streaming into the darkened room from the kitchen. "I need help," James said. "I'll help you." The boy nodded. "I can't get out." His father peeked inside, but saw no reason for the holdup. The boy simply didn't understand he could crawl out by himself. Without that knowledge, the curtains might as well be made of titanium. He crouched and looked at his boy. "Just move," he said. James rolled out like a half-trained acrobat, ass up in the air, feet slapping down hard. But still, he made it out. He looked from the bed to his father, amazed, as if he'd teleported. "I did that?" James said. "You did that," Red repeated. Red pulled back the room's curtains. Right outside his window was the fire escape, sturdy and flaking, painted a dull brown. One of their biggest expenses when moving in was to replace the security gate. The one that had previously been in the window wouldn't have kept out an aggressive pigeon. This back window looked out onto the building's alleyway below, where the garbage bins and recycling bins were lined up. Past the alleyway, a few hundred feet, you could see a small sliver of the George Washington Bridge's on-ramp. Some people look out their child's window and see trees, others suburban yards. This view was no less comforting to Red because it was his, and he had worked to achieve it. And pride is a feeling foreign to no one. He unlocked the security gate. There was a small dial to turn and a metallic snap as the tension in the lock released. He pulled open the gate and cracked the window so a little air might circulate for the day, then swung it closed again. Out on the fire escape, he saw 2 empty potato chip bags. Their upstairs neighbor had the charming habit of treating her living room window like a garbage chute, tossing shit out like there was a garbage can on the landing. Instead, there was only the fire escape below hers, where Red, Loretta, and James lived. One time, he found a whole bag of Chinese food cartons out there, as if the delivery man had just decided to leave it there instead of coming to the front door. James left the bedroom and moved toward the kitchen.
"I want waffles."
Red hadn't been sure if he was going to collect the chip bags right away, and the need to feed his son took precedence, so he just locked the security gate and trailed his son. They walked into the kitchen. The boy said,
"Come outside."
The floorboards in the kitchen creaked. No doubt Loretta was already awake, but she might like a little more time to lie in the bed. Keeping your eyes shut was nearly like sleeping. Red went into the freezer for the frozen waffles, pulled out the toaster. He was in the family bliss stage, but he wasn't making fresh waffles on a workday, let's be real. Meanwhile, James practiced going onto his tippy toes while holding the new kitchen table for balance.
"Come outside,"
the boy repeated. "We're having breakfast," he said. "We'll leave later." Red popped the waffles into the toaster. He found the coffee grounds and prepped his own breakfast, black, no sugar or milk. The boy lost his grip and slipped to the floor. His father crouched down, and the boy looked at him, grinning.
"Come outside."
Red lifted his son into his arms as the waffle toasted. "Why do you keep saying that?"
"Man say that,"
James said. "What man?" he asked.
"Come outside,"
the boy repeated. Three. Red didn't believe in magic, of course. He was a grown man. But having a child is like inviting a tiny sorcerer into your home. The flickering of light bulbs, the gurgle of a refrigerator motor, the thunder of an A-train. All of these are acts of wizardry to small children. They gasp or clap or shiver with glee to see it. Suddenly, the wind really does seem like a living thing kissing your cheeks. Their awe is so unguarded. Which is to say, he believed his son now. At least in a way. It's not that he thought a man had been talking to his son, but that in the night his son had heard a man, somewhere nearby, talking. On the street, or maybe in the alleyway right below. "Come outside." More than likely it had been the super who lived in the basement, and whose extended family treated the alleyway like their patio. In the summer, there would be parties, conversation, arguments, and even acts of, love going on down there, well after midnight. If his son's words caused a panic, it was only because he'd hoped to protect his child from the world's nonsense until he was older than 2. But maybe that was juvenile thinking on his part. You can't protect your children from life. You can only try to prepare them for it. So after Loretta woke up, he triple-checked the window and the window guard in the boy's room. He gathered up the potato chip bags and tossed them in the garbage. And then, really, that was all he could do. Time to get dressed and get to work. 5 periods of AP history, and then he covered an English class for Ms. Link, who'd called in sick. At the end of each period, most kids bolted. 1 or 2 stayed back not to ask questions, but to show him some awful video on their phones. Usually, they wanted him to see a fight that had been caught on video, or dashcam footage from a street camera in another country, usually Russia, where a horrific road accident nearly killed, or sometimes actually killed, people. They tended to show him the videos because they liked him. That's what they said. But as a new parent, holy shit, all it did was remind him of the world's dangers. As if he needed any reminding about that. Red picked James up from daycare at 5:30, took him through the park, and let him play for an hour. Normally, he'd let the boy run loose. But now he turned into the worst of helicopter parents, hovering close and even glowering at any man who passed too near, even the ones who were obviously playing with their own kids. Every passing teenager got the stink eye. James, thankfully, didn't notice a bit of this. The boy enjoyed the park, and that's it. When they got home, Loretta had already arrived. They switched jobs. She played with James. She'd missed him while helping to nurse other people's children, and he made dinner. They ate, then Mom and son went into the bathroom for a bath. When they came out, Red chased his naked boy around the small apartment.
Don't chase me,
the kid shouted in mock horror, but then looked over his shoulder for his father, slowing down, eyes excited and wide. Bedtime stories with Mom. Then, Dad carried him to bed. James went inside his sleeping compartment. From inside, he pulled the curtains shut. Dad checked the window and the security gate, both locked. He shut the door and went back to Loretta. They finished their dinners, and she went off to read in bed. Red washed the dishes. By the time he finished, Loretta had fallen asleep. He tucked her in and turned off the light, slipped her book onto the nightstand. Then he went back to his son's room and pushed the door open an inch or two. He stood in the doorway for a minute or 4. Red sat down in the room. He listened to James wheezing faintly, but his eyes never left the window. He fell asleep at his post, but never left it. 4.
Daddy? I'm awake.
Red had fallen asleep in a kind of self-imposed figure 4 leg lock. His son called, and he snapped out of his pretzeled-up position and let out a groan that would make a grandfather proud. Meanwhile, the boy spilled out from his makeshift bed, this time with the elegance of water flowing from a glass.
Be quiet,
the boy said. You giving me orders already? Red said, rubbing his creaky knees. Had he really spent 8 hours on the floor? He stood straight, and his neck lashed out in pain, and, yep, he'd really spent 8 hours on the floor. James walked toward his dad. His father lifted him up. Good walking, he whispered to James. He kissed him twice. Dad and son left the room, but then Red turned back around and stood at the window, pulled back the curtain, not sure what he expected to see. Nothing. The fire escape. But then he scanned up the stairs toward the floor above. An empty pack of cigarettes sat on the 6th stair. The carton was crumpled up. He knew the neighbor upstairs smoked, but he couldn't tell the brand of the box from here.
Owie,
James said, and Red realized his grip on the boy had become too tight. Okay, Red whispered. Sorry. Then he closed the curtains and brought James into the kitchen where Loretta was up and prepping breakfast. That beauty had already started making coffee. As soon as she saw James, she opened her arms and snatched him close. She kissed the boy, then frowned at her husband. Where were you all night? He took over with the coffee spooning the grounds into the filter. He took a moment to watch the shape of the grounds, as if he might read some hidden wisdom in them. Loretta had to tap his neck and ask again, "Where did you go?" "You didn't come look for me?" he asked. "Did you spend the whole night in James's room? Why?" Before he could answer, the boy spoke again.
Be quiet,
he said. His mother pulled her head back so she could look at the child directly. She did not wear any smitten expression now. "Excuse me?"
be quiet,
he said once more. But he wasn't sassing his mother. He spoke as if repeating a line he'd memorized, or something he'd heard.
He's listening.
Loretta looked confused. But Red turned so fast he lost control of the coffee bag, and it tipped over in his grip, splashing grounds across the floor. Be quiet. He's listening. James looked directly at Red, smiling.
Man say that.
5. He never thought he'd be the type of guy who lied to his wife. And yet he knew he couldn't tell Loretta he planned to spend the night up on the roof of their building. Impossible. At least, not without having to go into so much more detail about the things their son had been saying. About the idea of a man whispering to their child from the fire escape. A man who knew he'd been sitting in the room the night before. It would also sound too bonkers, and he didn't want to go through that whole phase where you have to convince your loved one that you're not imagining things, and they argue with you and all that horror movie shit. Besides, as a nurse, she'd seen more than a handful of people who'd slipped into manic states, and the protocol for such situations might see him committed, even just for 48 hours. And then, who would be home to watch over James in the night? No. He would lie and leave it at that. He told her he was planning a night out with his best friend, godfather of their child, a bender with a Raphael. To her credit, she did nothing more than tell him to enjoy himself. But he better not roll into the apartment at 4 a.m. and get sick in their bed. As long as he didn't do that, she said, he should enjoy himself. Also, he'd better be ready to cover the household when her best friend Angie came back into town, so she could have a ladies' night out. And because she trusted him, that was all it took. Red left the apartment by 7 o'clock and took the stairs up to the roof. The emergency alarm on the door hadn't worked in years. The sign and the big red bell were more like decoration. He pushed the door open, and for a moment enjoyed the swell of beauty that comes with seeing the George Washington Bridge at night. The span of it lit up like some minor star. Then he moved toward their side of the building and perched so he could peek down the fire escape, through the grated metal flooring, right to his son's bedroom. Then he waited. At 8 years old, his best friend was a boy named Chris Turner. The boys lived in the same building and treated their apartments as interchangeable home bases. Chris lived with his mother, father, and a Doberman Pinscher. The Doberman's name was Terror. It was his father's dog. The dog stood tall, even for a Doberman, and its fur carried a red tint that always made it seem as if it had been soaked in blood. Terror had been trained to love Chris's father, to tolerate Chris and his mother, but all other living things registered as prey. Whenever Red visited Chris, the dog had to be locked in the bathroom. But if kids visit, they're going to need the bathroom eventually. When Red simply couldn't hold it, Chris had to beg his dad to move Terror into the bedroom for the duration. It seems like a small task, but Chris's father huffed and growled like he'd been asked to sacrifice his right eye. One Saturday, Chris implored his father, who was busy reading the daily news in the kitchen. With great grumbling, his dad finally went to the bathroom and, a few moments later, called out to Red that the bathroom was clear. Red rushed in, shut the door, and began the glorious process. He peed with glee. But as his stream trailed off and the bathroom went quiet, Red felt a kind of pulse, or more like a tremor, play up the back of his legs. He heard panting and felt an awful tickle behind his left ear. His left eye fluttered as he turned and scanned the bathroom. Toilet, sink, towel rack, bathtub. Then, a faint rumble emitted from the tub. Terror's head rose. The Doberman watched Red, a surgeon already calculating the optimal spot for the first incision. His dread was total, made him lose all sensation. Where were Red's legs? They didn't seem to be there anymore. He couldn't collapse because he'd stiffened, the rictus of the long dead. He meant to shout or cry, but he could only squeal as mice do when dropped into a snake's cage. Terror stood on its paws, preparing to pounce. Then the bathroom door sprang open. Who stood there but Chris's father, laughing with malevolent delight? Chris's father stepped between Red and Terror, gave a wave of one hand, and the dog went back down into the tub. It was as if the man had made a demon disappear. Chris's father then shoved Red out of the bathroom, moving him like you would a bag of laundry. Red stood in the hallway, with his pants still unbuttoned. Chris's father looked down at him and sighed. Red's own father had always been a good, if tired man. Working in a supermarket, never a cashier, always in the back, left the man sore and sleepy almost all the time. But for all that, he'd been a decent man, top to bottom. At this moment, as he looked up at Chris's father, he understood there were other kinds of men who become dads. Cruel men weren't changed by parenthood. In retrospect, it almost seems silly that he had to wait until he turned 8 to realize such a thing. For a moment, Red felt an almost bottomless well of sadness for Chris. Who knew what he'd endured, and would continue to endure under the rule of a man like this? "Don't go crying," the man muttered with unguarded disgust. Then he slammed the door. With a start, Red snapped out of this memory, as rigid as he'd been in that bathroom 3 decades ago. How many hours had passed? Who could say? But the sun had gone down long ago, and the warmth of the day had dissipated. The night felt cool. And now, Red could see, without question, a figure standing on the fire escape. A man, at the threshold of his son's room, raising the window, crawling inside. Six. Did he run down the stairs, or did he fly? He moved, let's put it that way, and with such speed that he might have gone right off the edge of the fire escape and spilled into the alley below, breaking bones, ending his life. But this wasn't any other time. In fact, this felt like the only time that would ever matter. The only reason he even stopped before he reached the 3rd-floor landing was because his neighbor had, once again, left garbage outside her window. A pizza box and a big glass bottle, a 40-ounce of beer, the label shredded by his neighbor's fingernails. Red blessed her sloppiness and picked the bottle up. Now he had a weapon. With that, he descended to the 3rd floor. Red entered the apartment, amped and armed. And inside the darkened bedroom, he found Chris Turner's father. Terror on a leash. "What?" Red said. So surprised, he dropped the bottle. It didn't crack when it landed. Those bottles are as sturdy as a brick. Instead, it hit the wood floor with a thunk and rolled toward the dog. The Doberman lowered its head and sniffed the glass, then raised its head again and watched him. "How?" Red whispered. sounding and feeling like the boy in that bathroom 30 years ago. He felt the urge to pee. Perhaps he even gave in to it. Hard to tell as his body burned all over with a sudden flush. Chris Turner's father sneered at him, no different than he'd done that day. "Don't go crying," he said. With that, something changed. The voice felt familiar in a way that didn't align with that face. It wasn't that man's voice, but Red's. As if he was talking to himself. Now the dog disappeared, as did the old man, and in their place stood Red, dressed exactly as he was dressed now. How could he look so foreign to himself? It all came down to the expression this other version of him wore. Had Red ever hated anyone that much? The man took 2 steps and grabbed Red around the neck, a chokehold. Red still hadn't recovered from any of this, so he had no fight in him. He stayed stuck on stunned. The man choked Red, and Red gasped. His eyes watered and his vision blurred. He went down on a knee, and the man pressed harder against his throat. "Don't go crying," he grunted in Red's ear. Then, Red saw the bed, the makeshift sleep station he and Loretta built for James. He might as well be looking at an altar. It was the closest to a place he and his wife came for daily worship. How had his son stayed asleep during all this? The curtains were only half closed, so now he could see the mattress sat empty. Loretta must have brought James in to sleep with her tonight. She did that sometimes, if he was away. Tonight, it was the most blessed choice he could imagine. James lay in his parents' bed with his mother, which meant Red was here alone with this enemy, and free to fight. Red wrenched himself upward onto 2 feet, and the other man grunted with the force of it. Red forced himself backward, which sent the other man stumbling, until they slammed into the wall so loudly it sounded like a stun grenade. The other man's grip around Red's throat loosened. He pulled the forearm back and bit into the flesh. Red dug in deep enough to draw blood, but there was no blood. Instead, his mouth tasted only ashes, as if this man was made of dust. Red and the man fell to the floor, punching and slapping and scratching each other, a pair of feral animals. Red looked into this face. That was his own face, and felt this man to be a thwarted, bitter thing. Spiteful and lonely and wretched. This is what he might have become if not for Loretta, if not for James, if not for his parents and the teenagers at his school who cared for him enough to want to make him squirm. If not for a loved life, Red would be this. And perhaps, foolishly, he thought such a possibility had been left far behind. That he would never become a cruel father, a punishing husband, a vindictive teacher. But maybe that man is always at the window. Red and the man ground each other down as the night passed. While James and Loretta slept, Red struggled for his survival. He had to be the man they met in the morning. He spied the 40 bottle, still intact. He grasped for it, even as the man, just as exhausted as Red, drove his elbow into Red's ribs. Red grasped the bottle as he gasped in pain. He swung with all his force. He connected with the side of the man's face. A sick, soft thump, as satisfying as hitting a grand slam with an aluminum bat. He felt a jolt run up through his arm. The man fell to the floor, and Red raised the bottle, hit him square on the nose, and the nose bent in as softly as foam. Red brought the bottle down again. "You can cry," Red grunted. He didn't stop swinging the bottle until it broke across the man's face. Seven.
Daddy? I'm awake?
This is how Red realized he'd survived. His son, shouting from the doorway, cradled in his mother's arms. James looked pleased to see his papa, but Loretta wore a whole other expression. "Did you crack a 40 on the floor in your son's room?" she asked him. Red sat up. The broken glass lay everywhere, but there was no trace of all the blood. Instead, there were lines of dust on the hardwood floor. When he stood, he saw they traced a familiar silhouette. His own. Red looked at Loretta. "I guess I did," he said. "Well, why are you smiling about it?" Red fixed his face to look properly apologetic. "I'm sorry, darling." "That must have been one hell of a bender," she said. "I'll clean up," Red said. Loretta gave him one more glance. But hey, sometimes marriages are saved by the little things that go ignored. So, she went to the kitchen with James and said no more. Red turned to fix the window, still open. The security gate unlocked. He fixed that. Looking out on the landing, he saw that the fire escape had no garbage on it, and the landing above also sat trash-free. He took this as the best of signs. Even his neighbor had defeated her worst self. He got the broom and dustpan from the kitchen and did a thorough sweep in James's bedroom. He then got a whole roll of paper towels and filled a bowl with water, went back into James's room. He wet a few strips of the towels, then swept them across the floor. There were small slivers of glass, and also that dust. The last of what had been left behind by the enemy he'd defeated. When he was done, there was no trace of him. All gone. After that, he returned to the kitchen where Loretta and James were nearly done with breakfast. He sat with them, but he didn't feel hungry, only glad to be alive. Loretta had made hard-boiled eggs for James, tore the egg whites into small strips. The boy chewed one tentatively. "I made some coffee," Loretta said. Red looked to the kitchen counter. "I'm good," he said. She laughed as she got up from the table. "That's not like you," she said, as she set her dish in the sink. She left to use the bathroom. James swallowed the egg, then looked up at his father, and the child's gaze lingered there. Absently, the boy reached for another piece of egg white, but since he wasn't paying attention, he missed entirely and sent the plate to the floor. Luckily, the plate was plastic. "What's that?" Loretta called from the bathroom. "Just a spill," Red called back. But then, quick as lightning, he grabbed the child by the back of the neck and squeezed so tightly that James nearly choked. Red leaned close and whispered to the boy, "Don't go crying," he said. James looked closely at Red, neck still gripped tight. "Man," the child said softly. He grinned, but there was no joy in it. "You can call me Daddy now."